In a 2012 interview, Richard Dawkins was asked his thoughts about the afterlife. He responded with the following.
Let's be realistic about this. We have brains. It's brains that do the thinking. Our brains are going to decay. That'll be that.
Now, Dawkins is a very reasonable person, and his analysis makes a certain level of sense on the surface. If the intellect, or the part of us that does the thinking, is the same as the brain, then the intellect will decay when we die along with the rest of us, so we're not going to be doing any thinking after death. But what if we can show from reason that the part of us that does the thinking isn't the same as our brain matter? If we can prove conclusively that the intellect is immaterial, then it seems there's a chance that the thinking part of us can live on after our bodily death. So here's the argument I'm going to make. 1. When we know universals. 2. But universals are immaterial. 3. Therefore, when we know something that's immaterial. 4. But whatever knows something that's immaterial must itself be immaterial. Conclusion. Therefore, the intellect is immaterial. All right, now to the first point. When we know universals. Now, by universal, I mean something that's true about all examples of a thing. Here's an example to see what I'm talking about. Take these two trees, tree 1 and tree 2. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's different about them. Tree 1 is short, tree 2 is tall. Tree 1 has small leaves and lots of branches, tree 2 has really long leaves and no branches. Their trunks look different, they're different colors, different shapes, they have lots of differences. But there's also a lot of stuff they have in common, and that they wouldn't have in common with, say, a cactus or the Eiffel Tower. And we can call them by the same name, tree, to signify the reality of what they have in common. This is what is meant by a universal. Whatever different particular material things have in common. When we lump two things in the same category, we're recognizing a universal common between them. Another example of what I mean by a universal can be seen in mathematics. The number 4 is common to every group of one thing next to another thing, next to another thing, next to another thing. 4-ness is present every time we have 4 things together. The number 4 and every other number is a universal. It's something different material groups of objects can have in common. Second point, universals are immaterial. By immaterial, I just mean not material or not made of matter. We can see that universals must be immaterial by the fact that we can talk about the universals without talking about particular examples of these universals. When I talk about trees, I can talk about trees by pointing to particular examples of trees, like I did with tree 1 or tree 2, or I can just make general statements about trees. My thoughts about treeness, in a sense, are independent from particular material trees. Even if, by some catastrophe, every tree on the planet ceased to exist, I could still make claims about what a tree is. A tree would not cease to be a perennial woody plant having a main trunk and usually a distinctive crown if there were no things we could call trees. What's universal about trees is independent of material trees. This is more obvious with things that we don't have material examples of. We can talk about what a unicorn is, even though there's no real-world examples of unicorns we can point to. We can talk about what makes Peter Pan, even though there's no real person that has ever existed. The universals of unicorn and Peter Pan still exist, even though there's never been a bit of matter that could be called a unicorn or Peter Pan. These universals, then, must be immaterial. Final example, numbers. We can have knowledge of numbers independent of material objects adding up to those numbers. Let's say there's 8 quadrillion atoms in the universe. I know it's probably way higher than that. This is just an example. Now, of course, atoms aren't the smallest piece of matter either. There's protons and electrons smaller than them, and quarks smaller than them. There may even be smaller pieces out there. But whatever that smallest particle is, there's some limited number of those out there. Say it's 10 quintillion. Let's say there's 10 quintillion quarks in the universe. Okay. But we can still talk about 10 quintillion and 1, 10 quintillion and 2, etc. We can imagine numbers larger than the number of material things in the universe. This means that our knowledge of numbers goes beyond and exceeds the material things that numbers can apply to. The object of that knowledge, then, must stand outside and above material objects. It's non-material or immaterial. So when we know universals, and universals are immaterial. This means that when we know something immaterial. Okay, now for the next part. Whatever knows something immaterial must itself be immaterial. Why do I say this? Well, for something made out of matter to take on a universal is for it to physically become that universal. When a tree takes on what it is to be a tree, the only way it can do that is by physically being a tree. You can't have a material thing which has what it is to be a tree in it and isn't a tree. This is all definitional stuff, so I'm not really going to dwell on it. This next part is slightly more controversial. As we've said, when we know universals. But knowledge, I'm going to suggest, requires us to, in some sense, have the thing we're knowing inside us. I say this is slightly more controversial, but when you really think of it, it makes sense intuitively. When we think about trees, the idea of tree is in our thoughts, and if our idea of tree is going to reflect anything in the real world, it needs to be the same idea of tree as that contained in the universal tree found in the real world trees. If there were two ideas of trees, one in our thoughts and another in the trees, we wouldn't really be thinking about trees. So when we know, we have the universal of the thing we're knowing inside the part of us that does the knowing, the intellect. But as we've said, for a material thing to have a universal inside it is for it to physically become that universal. Now say the intellect was some bodily organ, say the brain. That would mean that the brain would have to physically become whatever it's thinking about. And that does not and could not happen. It's almost too obvious to say, but when we think about a tree, the matter in our brain doesn't suddenly shape itself into a full-grown tree. And if somehow our brain did turn itself into whatever it was thinking about, that means it wouldn't be able to think about anything else after that point. A tree isn't an intellect, so it can't think, so it can't turn into anything else. This is the bizarre conclusion of the claim that the intellect is identical to a material organ. If the intellect can't be material, then by definition it has to be immaterial or non-material. There's no third category between made of matter and not made of matter. The two are all encompassing by their very definitions. So, the conclusion follows. The part of us that knows things, the intellect, is immaterial, completely independent from all matter. All right. This means there's at least one part of us that isn't made out of matter. We're not just matter. There's at least one power we have which is immaterial, and we can prove that by philosophy. But think about the implications of this. Even if we're not just our matter, then there's at least one part of us that can exist without matter. Even if we didn't have matter, there's at least one part of us, our intellects, that would still exist. So, in principle, when we die and our matter goes away, at least one power in us, the power to think, the intellect, can continue to exist. It seems then that Dawkins' claim that when we die, that'll be that, is unfounded. It's not, as he said, the brain that does the thinking. It's an immaterial intellect. And since an immaterial intellect can survive death, we have reason to believe philosophically that we'll be able to keep on thinking after death. Now, clearly, this is a very limited understanding of an afterlife. The intellect might be an important part of you, but it's not you. And in order to say that we survive death, it's going to take more than just showing that one part of us survives. But this argument is sufficient to show that at least some part of us lives on after we die, and that Dawkins is wrong about life after death.